like to thank you for watching our walk through Romans. Today we're in Romans, the 13th chapter, starting with verse number 1. Now in Romans, the 13th chapter, the Apostle Paul is talking about governing authorities. And let me say this, he is not talking about church authority or church leadership. He is talking about civil authorities. There's a big difference between how a person rules as a civil authority and how a person is established in church authority or church government. And we don't have the time to go into that today, but you need to keep that in the back of your minds. Now, let's just do a little background here. At this time, Nero is the emperor of Rome. He is the one who's in charge. What he says happens. He is an emperor. He rules. Nero at this time is not persecuting the Christians nearly as much as the Jewish people are persecuting. Now, Nero is working along with the Jewish persons. When a Jewish rabbi or a Jewish Pharisee or Sadducee comes and says, you know what, this person, we want to execute this person, chances are the Roman government is going to say, go ahead and do it. But they themselves are not personally involved in persecution. Now, that's going to change. And it's going to change not so many years from the time that the Apostle Paul wrote this. So keep that in the back of your minds. At this time, there's a segment of Jewish people who want to do an open rebellion against Rome. This rebellion actually happened 10 years after the time of this writing, where they rose up and they opposed the Roman government, and you know what? They got put in their place, and the Roman government won, and many Jewish people lost their lives. So keep that in the back of your mind. Paul is writing to a group of people that are both Gentile and Jewish, but in that Jewish community, there are probably people who want to rebel against Rome. And also remember that Paul is writing to Roman Christians who he is telling that they need to submit to Nero. Now, was Nero a nice guy? No. Nero was not a nice guy. And Nero actually got to the point where he declares himself to be God. So keep that in the back of your minds as we look at these verses. Now, verse number 1 says, everyone must submit himself to governing authorities. For there is no authority except that which God has established. The word here, submit, means to come in order with. You see, we need to understand that this is not a submission as far as someone beating you up and killing you and things like that. This submission is saying God has set an order in civil authority, in civil life. And so what Paul is telling us is that we need to come in order. We need to line up with God's order. Okay? And then he goes on and he says, for there are no authority except that which God has established. Now, what's he talking about? He's talking about the place of authority, not necessarily the person in authority. Now, we're going to talk about that. God has established an order. He has established authorities. The word established means, it comes from the Greek word teso, and it means to set in place. God has set in place authorities. Now, the Greek word for authorities is exousia. It means a person in leadership or a place of leadership. God has established that. And we need to keep that in the back of our minds. And now we move on to the end of verse number 1, and it says, the authorities that exist have been established or have been placed in by God. Now, let me say this. I don't believe that every person in a place of authority has been placed there by God. You know, the book of Proverbs, chapter 29, verse 2, says, when the righteous increase, the people rejoice. But when the wicked man rules, people groan. I don't believe that God places wicked people in authority. Now you say, well, what are you talking about? I'm not talking about the position of authority. We're talking now about the person in that position. How many of you know there's many different ways to place a person in authority? You can have an election, like here in the United States. A person could win a civil war or a war and be placed in authority. That's what's happened here with the Roman government. Now, was Paul saying that God placed Nero in authority? No. He's saying that God made the position, but he's not necessarily saying he placed him in authority. That would be asinine to think that way. Why? Because Nero, not so many years later, is going to begin to kill Christians. Is that what God wants? No. So we need to understand that people in authority are not placed there by God, but God makes the position of authority. Now let's move on to verse number 2. And it says, therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they have opposed, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation on themselves. Resist. Antithesis is the Greek word. In other words, to come against the order of God. And when you come against the order of God, you are coming against God's ordinance. You're coming against what God has ordained. And again, it's not the person, it's the position. Do you understand? And you're coming against the ordinance, the will of God. And it says, they who have opposed will receive condemnation on themselves. The word condemnation is the Greek word krema, and it means a judgment. It means a sentence. You know what? If you oppose the authorities that God has placed, the position of authority that God has placed into your life, you're going to head into trouble. My time is up for today. Join us again tomorrow as we continue our study of the book of Romans.